This is not the first time we have heard this, both from reporting that has said this is what's being discussed in private in meetings between the Ukrainians, the United States, and the Russians in the United States. And this is not the first time we have heard any musings from the presidential office around this. I mean, we've heard Donald Trump talking about, the Ukrainians possibly giving up the land and territorial concessions. He says ultimately, the United States can't make them do that, but, he has suggested it. We know that there has been meetings where this was pushed to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have again and again rejected it in favor of what Trump demanded at the start of his second term, which is an immediate frontline ceasefire. And the lines are largely where they are for the foreseeable future until this could be resolved off the battlefield at a later date, right? Which is, due to the gulf in the positions of the two parties, the most likely outcome to stop the dying, right? That is a position that Trump not only let go of, it's a position he completely abandoned. He no longer even demands a ceasefire. And I remember when he dropped that demand, the Europeans and the Ukrainians had to go out there and redouble their asking for a ceasefire, because from their position, there was no reason to give up the ceasefire demand. There was no reason to give up the ceasefire demand because the ceasefire would prove Russian seriousness about actually not continuing with the war. Because if we get the Ukrainians to give up all of Donetsk and Luhansk, which again, I don't think is the likeliest outcome. But if we get them to do that and then the Russians just keep on marching, we're going to have egg on their face. The Ukrainian people are going to be, which would already be furious, would be doubly furious. And the war would continue with the Ukrainians in less entrenched positions that are less elevated and are now fighting across the wide open fields where Russia's infiltration efforts can continue to find minimal success at high cost, but still minimal success is still a type of success. I'm sure that is how the Russian generals like to write their reports. Minimal success is still a type of success, sir. Still a type of success. But we are again getting reports from this time the Financial Times that the United States has told Ukraine that in order to get security guarantees from the United States, and the way that it has been described is Europeans could have troops on the front line, being the ones that provide a physical barrier and a trip line force, meaning that if Russia invaded, they would by default be going to war with Germany and all these other states because they're firing at their soldiers, backed by an American backstop. This has been discussed before. What that American backstop is has still not been defined. Whether that would be American air power coming in to bomb advancing Russian soldiers, whether that would be massive aid packages from an administration that doesn't seem to like aid packages to begin with, whether that would be, unless it's to the Argentine government, whether that be, which is not at war, whether that be, I don't know. It's hard to say. We have the meeting. And they say to the Ukrainians, give up the land and you'll get your backstop, whatever that backstop is, air power, aid, etc. This is according to the Financial Times. Now, before we get into whether or not this is true, which I think there's a good chance that it is, let's discuss the logic of this. Now, first off, practical sake, giving up territory when the Russians have previously agreed to ceasefires that they immediately violated during this administration, during the Trump administration, this is within the last year, is giving a lot of trust to an untrustworthy partner. To withdraw from those territories, when the Russians then move in with their armies, that could lead to them then launching new attacks. I mean, you're putting a lot of trust and the Russian armed forces to not spark up the war again. And you're not only giving them a lot of trust, you're not only getting a lot of more people displaced from their homes that don't necessarily have to be displaced from their homes, but not only would Ukraine have less territory and less homes of the people that they were defending and more people displaced, more people losing all of their property. And, a lot of people, what they own is their village house, is their goats, is their this, that, XYZ. That's all they own. They lose their property, they get displaced, and Ukraine also loses defensible territory. In the Donetsk region, it's elevated. Kramatorsk and Slovyansk are twin cities that if you get to a ridge overlooking it, you can see it from miles. I swear to you, I could not see the end of one city to another. I could not see the end of Kramatorsk when looking out. Pokrovsk was a city of roughly 60,000. Kramatorsk is in the triple digits, as in the hundreds of thousands, right? I mean, we're talking about 100,000 people there right now. Before this full-scale war, there were hundreds of thousands more people in that city and Slovyansk. That's a lot of urban infrastructure. And there are a lot of entrenchments leading up to that city. The Ukrainians had been building defensives not only behind Pokrovsk, but also in front of Pokrovsk. But I mean, not behind. Well, they have been making defenses behind Pokrovsk, but it's also not just behind Kramatorsk, but in front of Kramatorsk. So you're giving up your defensible positions. You're displacing a lot more people, all for a promise from an unreliable partner, both in the eyes of the United States as an unreliable partner, but of course the Russians as well as an unreliable other side to this this arrangement. Not to mention, there was also the base instinct of, do you reward this type of behavior? Will they come back for more? If a dog barks and barks and barks to get your attention and you go and you pet it, will they just now bark and bark and bark and be loud to get your attention? If a child throws their toys out the pram and then you come and say, oh, what's up? Yeah. Are they going to do that every time now to get your attention? If the Russians think they can get away with this once, maybe they think they can get away with it again, but better planned, better organized, with a better idea of what they're getting into. Since this time they did really think they'd walk in, kick in the door, and the entire rotten edifice of Ukraine would crumble to the floor. Didn't exactly work that way. So for all of these reasons, as well as the fact that it's unpopular in Ukraine, and some might even say politically suicidal in Ukraine, I do not believe the Ukrainians are going to negotiate that territory away. And they're certainly not going to recognize occupied territory, which is another strong demand that the Russians are putting forward. So I don't see how Ukraine gets that backstop under this framework as it stands. Because the Ukrainians are not going to abandon these cities. They're not going to abandon these defensive positions they've built up for years. I mean, they've won Kramatorsk. They won Kramatorsk in a fight back in 2014. There was a fight for it. They won it. And now they have to give it up without a fight. There's a lot of people in Ukraine just from not only the sense of abandoning their neighbors, the sense of abandoning their home, the sense of rewarding the Russians, but the general sense of justice, that people don't feel comfortable taking their PlayStation 3, or in this instance, their home, and handing it over to the burglar, thinking, I'm sure the burglar will not come back and attack anyone else on this street that has shown them that they can come away with new things, new toys. So I think for all of these reasons, that making this a requirement for a U.S. backstop just likely drags the war out longer. Instead of bringing the pressure on the Russians to bring them to the table, you're again putting the pressure on the Ukrainians on a point that they cannot concede politically or defensively when talking about the battlefield. And it further sends home the message to the Russians that Ukraine's defense is not that important to the United States. And so how much value will a backstop even have in the first place? Remember, Donald Trump said, when discussing Greenland, what can I defend if I can't own it? I don't defend what I don't own. So I think for Donald Trump's rhetoric, this does seem like a believable statement. Now, the U.S. government denies it. They denies, quote unquote, forcing Ukraine on territory. Let me read this. This is from the Kiev Independent. Trump administration is again pressuring Kiev by seeking to tie U.S. security guarantees to Ukraine's agreement to cede unoccupied areas of the Donbass to Russia. The Financial Times reported on January 27th, citing 8 people familiar with the talks. The reported push comes as Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. re-engage in active diplomacy and President Donald Trump's latest effort to end the war, with the next round of talks expected on February 1st. Washington has reportedly told Kiev that security guarantees would come only after Ukraine reaches a peace deal with Russia, a deal likely to involve territorial concessions in the Donbass. Kiev has pushed for guarantees to be secured before agreeing to any loss of territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly emphasized that foreign security guarantees are essential to any peace deal. By the way, that means here's the land. Now, can we discuss what the backstop is? And when the backstop is blurry, that's the question. Because if the question is, okay, we'll cede the land, then you give us a peace backstop, and then the backstop ends up being $20 billion in aid, yay, then that's not a backstop. And it means that the Donald Trump administration got the Ukrainians to give up people's homes in return for another security assurance, like it's the Budapest Memorandum all over again. So even if they were willing to give that up and take the political heat for giving up unoccupied Ukrainian land, let alone the land that's currently occupied, or at least allowing it to stay where it is, the Trump administration is, I mean, it could be giving that up for a non-disclosed, undisclosed mystery backstop support. Could be one airstrike, could be 20, could be who knows. That information is not public. For us, security guarantees are first and foremost guarantees from the United States, the Ukrainian president told reporters on January 25th. Ukrainian European officials described the approach to the Financial Times as an attempt to force Kiev into painful territorial concessions that Moscow has no intention of reciprocating. A U.S. source familiar with the matter told the Kiev Independent that Washington is trying to force any territorial concessions upon Ukraine. Both sides must agree to a peace deal, but the contents of the peace deal are up to Russia and Ukraine, the source added without elaborating. Russia has long demanded that Ukraine withdraw from the Donbass. So the U.S. force is saying both sides must agree to a peace deal, but the contents of the peace deal are up to Russia and Ukraine, right? And that they're not trying to force and demand them to withdraw from the Donbass. But if Donald Trump says we will only give you security guarantees and more support once you come to a deal, by the way, Russia's only acceptable deal is you give up more land. For who knows if the deal will actually hold, since, you know, even the ceasefires that Trump supposedly negotiated have already failed during the last year. I mean, it doesn't seem that steady of an agreement. It doesn't seem like it has much foundation to it. But that, to me, is saying, even if we were to say that isn't forcing, that is saying, hey, you'll get our support once you make a deal. By the way, here's their request. Ooh, you know, we're not going to help you move them on that request. Anyway, good luck. So if you're saying you'll only support once they agree to the Russian deal, but the Russians don't move, or they agree to a deal and the Russians aren't moving off their deal, what are you saying? Agree to the deal that's on the table. Agree to the deal that's on the table. Donald Trump doesn't care what deal's agreed to. Just agree to the deal that's on the table. 24 hours, everybody. 24 hours. This type of dialogue, these types of pushing of the Ukrainian government by the Trump administration will do nothing but embolden the Russians and drag the war out longer. I don't care if you think Trump has the aesthetics of a warmonger. He is dragging the war out. And whether he meant to do that intentionally or by mistake, Donald Trump is one of the main forces continuing the war in Ukraine at this point. Also, listen to Marco talking about security guarantees for Ukraine as he tries to define them. Listen to any detail of what that would actually be.
There's a lot of talk about security guarantees, and it's something that there's general agreement about now with the case of Ukraine. But those security guarantees basically involve the deployment of a handful of European troops, primarily French in the UK, and then a U.S. backstop. But in fact, the security guarantee is the U.S. backstop. It is not and I'm not diminishing the fact that some countries in Europe are willing to place troops in a post-war Ukraine. What I'm pointing out is that is irrelevant without the U.S. backstop. And the reason why you need such a strong U.S. backstop is because our allies and our partners have not invested enough in their own defense capabilities over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully that is changing.
Backstop, backstop, backstop. What's the backstop? How is it something that is insignificant is turned into significance through the backstop? Is that American soldiers? After Trump said no troops on the ground under no circumstance, he made that concession immediately once going into the White House, as if to tell Putin, take whatever you can get out of my goddamn pockets. He gave up so many concessions early on that by the time that they actually sat down for trilateral talks, there's nowhere for Ukraine to go but either through the path of hard power and pressuring the Russians to come and reestablish their position, reconsider their position, or concession. and the concessions the Russia's demanding are inoperable concessions. So we're stuck, and we're continuing, and we're stuck with these lack of security guarantees, with this lack of physical support from the United States, and talking about a backstop with no details, talking about having the Russians and the Ukrainians sitting down at the same table as a massive diplomatic accomplishment when this was supposed to happen before Trump even got into the White House. The Trump administration has lowered the standards to such an amount that having a Russian military agent speak to Budanov, a Ukrainian intelligence agent, at a trilateral meeting with the United States, where progress when it comes to getting a final deal signed and dotted and done, there was nothing to publicly speak of on the matter. Besides, what did the people in Abu Dhabi say? Oh, yeah, they said constructive. Yeah, specificity would have been given if Trump had something to brag about. Whoa. Cereal for every meal. Thank you for the raid of 338. My goodness. What a crowd of people.